France, late summer 1944. The convoy rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like smoke from distant artillery. Three jeeps, two staff cars, and a security detail that looked more nervous than the situation warranted. But then again, they were carrying the supreme Allied commander through territory that had been in German hands less than a week ago. General Nathaniel Westbrook stepped out of the lead vehicle, his uniform immaculate despite the heat and the journey. Four stars gleamed on his collar. His aide rushed forward with a clipboard rattling off the schedule, but Westbrook was already scanning the forward command post with the practiced eye of a man who had seen too many of these installations to be impressed by any of them. Tents arranged in precise rows, radio antennas reaching toward a sky that promised rain, soldiers moving with the purposeful efficiency that came when word spread that the big boss was coming to visit. Everything clean, everything organized, everything ready for inspection, everything perfect. Which meant Westbrook knew from long experience that he was seeing exactly what they wanted him to see. He walked past the command tent without stopping, ignoring his aide's gentle suggestion that the Third Army staff was waiting inside to brief him. Westbrook had read the briefings, read them twice. What he wanted now was to see something real, something that hadn't been prepared for his arrival. The motor pool stretched out to his left, a collection of jeeps and trucks in various states of repair. Mechanics worked under the vehicles, their legs protruding at odd angles. The smell of diesel fuel and hot metal filled the air. This was more like it. This was where the real work happened. A small group of soldiers clustered around a vehicle near the edge of the pool. Westbrook could hear the frustration in their voices before he could make out the words. A machine gun mounted on the jeep, and from the way they were gesturing at it, something wasn't working right. One officer knelt beside the weapon. His uniform was dirty, streaked with grease and mud. He wore a plain helmet with no visible rank. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had field-stripped this weapon 1,000 times before. Just another field-grade officer doing his job. Westbrook almost walked past. Almost. But something made him pause. The way the officer moved, perhaps. The set of his shoulders. The other soldiers stood at a respectful distance, not quite at attention, but not quite relaxed either. The deference in their posture didn't match the plain uniform of the man they were watching. The officer looked up, and Nathaniel Westbrook, who had known this man for 35 years, who had served with him in Mexico and France in the last war, who had studied alongside him at West Point and argued strategy with him in a dozen different headquarters across 2 continents, felt his breath catch in his throat. Those eyes. God help him, he knew those eyes. "Marcus," Westbrook said, and his voice came out wrong. Too quiet, too shocked. "Is that really you?" General Marcus Thaddeus Bradford straightened up slowly. Grease covered his hands. Mud streaked his face. Not a single star visible anywhere on his person. He looked like a major who had spent too long at the front and not enough time near a proper shower. He grinned. That smile, Westbrook thought, distantly belonged on a man about to get away with something he absolutely shouldn't be getting away with. "Hello, Nate," Bradford said. His voice carried that peculiar mix of Georgia drawl and West Point precision that had always made him sound like he was delivering a formal briefing and telling a barroom joke at the same time. "Didn't recognize me without the chrome pistols, did you?" Westbrook stared. The Supreme Allied Commander of all Allied forces in Western Europe, a man who had planned the invasion of an entire continent, who commanded millions of men and answered only to the President and Prime Minister, stood there staring at his subordinate like a man who had just watched the ground open up beneath his feet. "What?" Westbrook said carefully. "Are you doing?" Bradford gestured at the machine gun, with hands that were definitely not befitting a 3-star general. "Firing mechanisms jammed. These boys were about to declare the whole weapon deadlined when it just needs proper maintenance. Figured I'd show them the right way." The soldiers around them had gone very still. They were starting to realize that the plain uniformed officer they'd been watching was considerably more important than his appearance suggested. Westbrook became aware that his entire staff had caught up with him now. They stood in a loose semicircle, staring at the scene with expressions that ranged from confusion to barely suppressed horror. Bradford noticed them too. He grabbed a rag and started wiping the grease from his hands with movements that suggested he had all the time in the world. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said pleasantly. "Sorry I wasn't there to meet you at the command post. Lost track of time." Lost track of... Westbrook couldn't finish the sentence. His mind was trying to process too many things at once. "Marcus, you're the commanding general of Third Army. You have people who can fix weapons. You shouldn't be wandering around without proper security, without a staff looking like..." He gestured helplessly at Bradford's appearance. Looking like what? Bradford asked. A soldier. He said it simply, without irony, without defiance, just a statement of fact that somehow carried the weight of an entire philosophy. That's what I am, Nate. The stars are just paperwork. And I'll tell you something else. Bradford stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Westbrook could hear. I learned more in 2 hours out here than I learned in 2 days reading reports. Westbrook wanted to argue, wanted to point out the security risks, the protocol violations, the sheer recklessness of an Army commander making himself this vulnerable. But he had seen Bradford's results. Third Army was advancing faster than any other force in the European theater, taking more ground, suffering fewer casualties, maintaining higher morale despite operating at the ragged edge of their supply lines. And now Westbrook knew why. We need to talk, Westbrook said. I figured, Bradford replied. To understand what Nathaniel Westbrook had just witnessed, you need to understand that there were two versions of Marcus Bradford that existed simultaneously in the late summer of 1944. There was the public Bradford, the one the photographer loved, the one soldiers told stories about, the one whose image appeared in Stars and Stripes and hometown newspapers across America. This Bradford wore boots polished to a mirror shine. Every morning, his orderly spent 20 minutes on those boots alone working the leather until you could see your reflection in them. His uniform was tailored, fitted perfectly to his frame by the same London tailor who had made uniforms for British field marshals. Not a wrinkle, not a loose thread. Immaculate. His helmet liner bore 3 stars clearly visible from 100 yards away. Chrome-plated, catching the light, announcing to everyone within sight that here was a general, here was authority, here was command. But the pistols. The pistols were what people remembered. 2 of them. Chrome-plated like the stars on his helmet, custom-made by a gunsmith in Nashville before the war. Not ivory like some generals preferred. Chrome, modern, industrial, American. They sat in hand-tooled leather holsters on his belt, and when Bradford walked, they caught the light and threw it back like signals. This was deliberate theater. Bradford understood something that many of his peers did not. He understood that soldiers needed symbols, needed something to remember, needed an image that would stay with them when the shells started falling and the world reduced itself to mud and fear and the man next to you screaming for his mother. The polished boots, the gleaming sidearms, the swagger. These were props in a performance designed to inspire, to create the kind of confidence that kept men moving forward when every instinct told them to dig in and hide. Bradford would stand on the hood of a Jeep, those weapons gleaming at his sides, and tell his men that they were going to attack and keep attacking until the enemy begged for mercy, and the men would believe him, because he looked like what they expected a conquering general to look like. Imposing, authoritative, instantly recognizable. That was the public Bradford. But there was another Bradford, the one that actually spent time at the front. This Bradford wore standard issue gear, an ordinary uniform that could belong to any officer above the rank of captain, a field jacket that had seen actual field use mud-stained and worn, a regulation helmet without any rank markings, the kind that thousands of officers wore up and down the line. Sometimes he carried a rifle instead of his famous sidearms. Sometimes he helped push a stuck vehicle out of the mud. Sometimes he sat in a foxhole eating K-rations with a lieutenant who had no idea he was sharing his meal with an army commander. This version looked like a major or a lieutenant colonel. Someone important enough to be at forward positions, but not so important that snipers would spend extra effort trying to kill him. This Bradford could walk through his own units without being recognized, could inspect positions without causing the disruption that came when everyone knew the commanding general was watching, could get honest assessments from junior officers who didn't realize they were talking to a 3-star general. Most generals maintained one image. Bradford maintained 2, and he switched between them depending on what the situation required. The lesson had come early in the war, and it had come hard. Tunisia, February 1943. Bradford, newly promoted to command of what would become Third Army. He had read the doctrine studied the great commanders believed that proper staff work and efficient reporting would keep him informed of everything he needed to know. The reports came in on schedule, neat, organized, color-coded tabs separating intelligence from logistics from personnel. Every morning his chief of staff would brief him. Every evening he would read the summaries. The picture they painted was always clear, always reassuring. All units at full strength or close to it, all equipment operational or scheduled for repair, all supply requirements being met, all morale indicators positive, until he ordered an attack based on those reports and watched it fall apart in the first 2 hours. Units that were supposedly at 80% strength turned out to be at 60%. Equipment listed as operational broke down within miles. Supply dumps that should have contained 3 days of ammunition had less than one. And morale, that most difficult thing to measure, that intangible quality that made the difference between an army that could fight and an army that would break, was considerably lower than any report had suggested. The attack failed. Not catastrophically, but failed nonetheless. 300 casualties, 40 miles of retreat. The entire operation had to be called off and replanned. Bradford spent 3 days after that failure doing something his staff thought was a waste of time. He visited every unit that had participated in the attack. Not announced visits, not official inspections, just showed up, talked to officers and sergeants, asked questions. What he discovered made him physically ill. The reports hadn't been lies exactly. They had been optimistic assessments that got more optimistic at each level they passed through. A company commander reporting 60% strength to his battalion commander, who rounded that up to 65% when reporting to regiment, who called it 70% when reporting to division, who labeled it 75% by the time it reached Army headquarters. Each level making the numbers just a little better. Each level filtering out the problems, minimizing the issues, putting the best possible face on the situation. By the time information reached Bradford's desk, it had been sanitized, processed, and stripped of anything that might reflect poorly on the reporting chain. He was commanding an army based on fiction. The realization changed everything. If Bradford wanted to know what was really happening on the ground, the actual situation, he couldn't rely on reports that filtered up through 5 layers of command. He had to see it himself. Had to talk to the men who were actually doing the fighting, the sergeants managing the supplies, the junior officers making the tactical decisions. But if he showed up in his polished boots and chrome-plated weapons with his stars gleaming and a staff trailing behind him, everyone would put on a show. Positions that were dirty would be cleaned in minutes. Equipment that wasn't working would suddenly work. Problems would disappear. He would see exactly what they wanted him to see. The solution came to him one morning while shaving. What if he didn't look like a general? What if he looked like just another field officer? The kind that moved between units coordinating operations. The kind that nobody paid particular attention to because there were hundreds of them doing the same job. What if he became invisible? The first time he tried it, Bradford felt ridiculous. Stripping off his tailored uniform, his polished boots, his distinctive weapons, putting on standard issue everything. Looking in the mirror and seeing someone who could be any major in Third Army. He took a Jeep, drove himself. No aid, no security, no announcement. Just showed up at a forward position and started asking questions. The response was everything he had hoped for and everything he had feared. The lieutenant he talked to was honest, brutally honest, complained about ammunition shortages that official reports denied existed, pointed out equipment failures that maintenance records claimed had been fixed, described morale problems that didn't appear in any assessment Bradford had read, because this lieutenant thought he was talking to a major from division staff. Someone who might be able to fix things, but wasn't important enough to lie to. Bradford took notes, asked more questions, thanked the lieutenant, and drove away. 6 hours later, trucks loaded with ammunition pulled into that position. Maintenance teams arrived to replace the faulty equipment. The problems the lieutenant had described started getting fixed. The lieutenant never knew he had been talking to the Army commander, and Bradford had his proof of concept. This was how he would command Third Army. Not from reports and briefings and carefully stage-managed inspections. From reality. From seeing with his own eyes and hearing with his own ears what was actually happening at the sharp end of his army. He would be 2 generals. The public one to inspire, the invisible one to understand. The system worked better than Bradford had dared hope. He developed a pattern, a rhythm. Days when he was the public general making speeches and handing out medals and posing for photographs. Days when he was the invisible general driving to forward positions in unmarked gear and gathering information that reports would never tell him. The field hospital visit was typical of how he operated. Bradford arrived in mid-afternoon wearing a major's uniform with no name tag and no unit insignia. Just another staff officer checking on medical capabilities. The hospital was a collection of tents arranged in a field that had been a German artillery position 3 weeks earlier. You could still see the shell craters. Inside, the smell hit him first. Antiseptic trying to cover blood, and worse. The sounds came second, moaning, quiet conversations between nurses and patients. The occasional scream when someone's medication wore off at the wrong time. Bradford walked between the cots, nodding at the wounded men. Most were in too much pain or too heavily medicated to pay him much attention. But some were alert, and Bradford stopped to talk with them. How was the care? Were the doctors competent? Were they getting enough morphine? Was the food edible? The men answered honestly because they thought they were talking to someone from division staff. Someone who might actually care about their complaints, but wasn't so high up that they needed to watch what they said. The picture that emerged was not what Bradford's reports had told him. Medical supplies were adequate, but not abundant. Some doctors were excellent. Others were exhausted to the point of making mistakes. Morphine supplies were tight. The food was terrible. And the nurses. The nurses were working 18-hour shifts because there weren't enough of them, and some were starting to crack under the pressure. Bradford thanked the men for their service, told them they were the reason America was going to win this war. Meant every word. Then he walked out of the hospital and got in his Jeep. 6 hours later, 3 trucks arrived at that field hospital. One contained medical supplies. One contained additional morphine and other medications. One contained 10 fresh nurses transferred from a rear area hospital that was overstaffed. The chief medical officer stood there watching the trucks unload, trying to figure out how headquarters had known about his problems. He had submitted a request 2 weeks ago and been told that his needs were being reviewed. Now suddenly everything he had asked for was showing up at once. He never made the connection to the quiet major who had walked through his hospital that afternoon. The pattern repeated itself across Third Army. Bradford would show up somewhere in unmarked clothing, ask questions, observe, listen. Problems would get fixed. Units would receive exactly what they needed, mysteriously, efficiently, as if someone in the command structure actually knew what was happening at the front lines. Because someone did. The supply depot incident was different. That one turned into something Bradford hadn't expected. He arrived at a major ammunition storage facility wearing his usual unmarked uniform. Told the guard at the gate he was from Corps headquarters checking on inventory procedures. The guard waved him through without much interest. Bradford spent an hour walking around the depot watching how supplies moved through the system. Most of it was exactly what he expected. Organized chaos. Supplies coming in from the rear, getting sorted, moving forward to units that needed them. But then he noticed something odd. A group of officers loading crates onto a civilian truck. Not a military vehicle. A civilian truck with French plates and no military markings. Bradford moved closer, staying in the shadows between stacks of crates. The officers were laughing, joking, acting like men doing something they had done many times before. One of them had a manifest that he kept checking, making marks with a pencil. Bradford got close enough to see what was in the crates. Ammunition, medical supplies, cigarettes, items that were in short supply throughout Third Army, items that units were screaming for. Items that official reports claimed were inadequate stock. These officers were stealing them, loading them onto a civilian truck to sell on the black market that had sprung up across liberated France. Bradford's first instinct was to stride over there, announce who he was, and put every one of them under arrest. But he couldn't. If he revealed himself, the whole point of his disguise would be compromised. Word would spread. Every position he visited after this, soldiers would be looking for General Bradford in disguise. His ability to gather unfiltered information would be destroyed. So he stood there in the shadows, watched, memorized faces, noted the license plate on the truck, made mental notes of everything he was seeing. Then he walked away, got in his Jeep, drove back to headquarters. That night he called in his provost marshal, described what he had seen, gave enough information for the military police to investigate without revealing his source. 3 days later, MPs raided the depot, caught the officers in the act of loading another truck, arrested 7 men, recovered enough stolen supplies to equip an entire battalion. The investigation revealed a network of corruption that had been operating for months, hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen military property. All of it happening while frontline units were rationing ammunition and medical supplies. Bradford watched the court-martial proceedings from a back row wearing his full uniform this time. The officers being tried never knew that the quiet major who had witnessed their crime was the 3-star general sitting 30 feet behind them. And Bradford learned something important. His invisibility wasn't just a tool for gathering information. It was a weapon against the corruption and incompetence that existed in every large organization. Problems that would be hidden from an official inspection could be seen by a man who appeared to be nobody important. Captain Donovan Pierce first noticed something was wrong on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. He was leading a patrol through a sector that Third Army had liberated 2 days earlier. Checking defensive positions, making sure the handoff from combat units to occupation forces was proceeding smoothly. Routine work that Pierce had done a dozen times before. He saw the officer from a distance, kneeling next to a machine gun emplacement, talking with the sergeant who was manning it. The officer wore a major's uniform, ordinary and dirty, like someone who had been at the front for a while. Nothing unusual about that. The sector was full of staff officers checking various things. Pierce started to walk past, but something made him pause. The way the officer moved, the set of his shoulders, the way the sergeant was standing at a kind of modified attention, respectful but not quite formal. Pierce changed his angle of approach, got a better look at the officer's profile, and felt his stomach drop. He knew that profile, had seen it in briefings and photographs in the flesh on the 3 occasions when General Bradford had addressed assembled officers. But that couldn't be right. General Bradford was back at Army headquarters. General Bradford wore tailored uniforms and distinctive weapons and stars that you could see from the next county. This officer wore none of those things. Pierce moved closer, trying to be casual, trying not to stare. The officer stood up and Pierce saw his hands, saw the distinctive scar on the left hand running from the base of the thumb to the wrist. A scar Pierce had noticed the one time he had shaken hands with General Bradford, an injury from some long-ago training accident. That scar was not something that appeared in photographs or official portraits. It was the kind of detail you only noticed in person, the kind of detail that couldn't be faked. Pierce felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. That was General Bradford, the commanding general of 3rd Army, wearing unmarked clothing, kneeling in the mud beside a machine gun emplacement, talking to a sergeant who clearly had no idea who he was talking to. The officer finished his conversation and started walking. Pierce watched him go, his mind racing through the implications. Should he report this? Who would he report it to? What would he even say, "Sir, I saw General Bradford pretending to be a major"? They would think he was insane, or mistaken, or making up stories for attention. But Pierce knew what he had seen. That scar was unmistakable. Bradford disappeared around a corner, and Pierce made a decision. He wouldn't report this. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. Instead, he would watch, observe, document. That night, back at his quarters, Pierce pulled out a small notebook, the kind officers used to jot down tactical observations or notes for after-action reports. On the first page, he wrote August 23, 1944. Confirmed General Bradford conducts reconnaissance in unmarked uniform. Observed him at machine gun emplacement. Recognized by scar on left hand. Beginning documentation. 3 weeks passed. Pierce watched, waited, documented. He saw Bradford twice more. Once at a forward observation post talking with a young lieutenant about artillery support. Once at a supply checkpoint inspecting how materials were being distributed. Each time Bradford wore unmarked gear. Each time the soldiers he talked to had no idea they were speaking with their Army commander. And each time Pierce noticed something. Within hours of Bradford's visits, problems got fixed. Supplies arrived. Issues that had been festering for weeks suddenly got resolved. The pattern was undeniable. Units across 3rd Army started noticing it too. Problems they reported would be fixed faster than seemed possible. Supply requests that should have taken weeks to process would be fulfilled in days. Staffing issues that required multiple layers of approval would be resolved almost instantly. And officers started talking about the mysterious field-grade officers who would show up asking detailed questions, then disappear. Was it the same officer? Different officers. Some kind of roving inspection team that nobody had been told about. Nobody knew, but the rumors started to spread. Pierce kept his observations to himself. But he listened to the rumors, watched the patterns, and understood what Bradford was doing in a way that most soldiers couldn't. The general wasn't spying on his troops. He was learning reality, getting unfiltered information that would help him make better decisions, seeing what was really happening instead of what reports claimed was happening. It was brilliant, and it was working. The staff meeting that afternoon was typical of the organized chaos that characterized 3rd Army headquarters. Colonel Victor Ashford, the Chief of Staff, stood at the map board pointing at colored pins that represented units and objectives. Officers filled the chairs, taking notes, asking questions, doing the necessary work of coordinating an army of 300,000 men. General Bradford's chair sat empty. Ashford paused in mid-sentence, looking at the empty chair with an expression that Pierce had seen before. Frustration mixed with resignation. "Has anyone seen the general this morning?" Ashford asked. The other officers looked at each other, shook their heads. "He left at 0600, sir," an aide volunteered. "Said he was conducting forward reconnaissance." "Forward reconnaissance," Ashford repeated in a tone that suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "Did he say where?" "No, sir." "Did he take security?" "No, sir, just his driver." Ashford closed his eyes briefly. Of course he didn't. The meeting continued without Bradford. It had to. The Army couldn't stop functioning just because its commander had disappeared for a few hours. Again, Pierce sat in the back row and said nothing. He knew where Bradford was. Not the exact location, but he knew what the general was doing. Somewhere in 3rd Army's operational area, a man in unmarked clothing was talking to soldiers who had no idea they were talking to their commanding general. Gathering information. Learning what the reports wouldn't tell him. Seeing what was real instead of the sanitized version that filtered up through the chain of command. The meeting ended. Officers filed out talking among themselves about the day's business. Pierce stayed in his seat watching Ashford gather up his papers. The chief of staff looked tired, worn down by the daily struggle of trying to run an army whose commander insisted on disappearing without notice. "Captain Pierce," Ashford said, noticing him, "something I can help you with." Pierce hesitated. This was his chance. He could tell Ashford what he knew, explain about the disguises, the covert visits to forward positions, help the staff understand what their commander was doing, but something stopped him. If he revealed Bradford's secret, what would change? Would Ashford order Bradford to stop? Would the invisible general be forced to become only the public general, making decisions based on reports instead of reality? Would that make 3rd Army better or worse? "No, sir," Pierce said. "Just reviewing my notes." Ashford nodded and left. Pierce sat alone in the empty briefing room, thinking about secrets and reality and the man who lived 2 lives to command his army effectively. His notebook was in his pocket. Weeks of observations, documented sightings, patterns emerging from the data. Nobody knew but him. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The phone on the conference table rang. Once. Twice. Pierce answered it. "Captain Pierce, this is General Westbrook's aide. The general requests a secure line to 3rd Army headquarters immediately. He needs to speak with General Bradford." "Yes, sir," Pierce said. "I'll arrange it right away." He hung up and stared at the phone. Westbrook wanted to talk to Bradford, the Supreme Allied Commander calling the 3rd Army commander. That could mean a lot of things, but none of them were routine. Pierce stood up and went to find Colonel Ashford, who would tell him once again that nobody knew where General Bradford was, and the machinery of 3rd Army would keep turning, powered by information that only one man could see and that everyone else was just beginning to suspect. Somewhere out there in a forward position that wouldn't appear in any official log, a man in unmarked clothing was learning something that would save lives tomorrow, and nobody would ever know his name. The summons came at 1700 hours. Not a request, not a suggestion. A direct order from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, delivered by encrypted wire with the kind of brevity that indicated someone very important was very displeased. "General Bradford will report to SHAEF headquarters immediately for consultation regarding operational procedures." Colonel Ashford read the message twice, then looked up at the aide who had delivered it. "Find him," Ashford said quietly. The aide's expression said everything. Finding General Bradford when he didn't want to be found was like finding a specific raindrop in a thunderstorm. "Sir, he left this morning on—" "I don't care what he called it," Ashford interrupted. "I don't care if he's meeting God himself. Find him. Tell him the Supreme Commander wants to see him. Now." It took 3 hours. Bradford arrived at his own headquarters just after 8 in the evening, driving himself in a Jeep that had seen better days. He wore unmarked clothing. Mud covered his boots. His face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from spending a full day pretending to be someone you weren't. Ashford met him at the entrance, holding out the message without a word. Bradford read it. His jaw tightened. He handed it back. "How long ago did this arrive?" 5 hours, sir." "And Westbrook knows I wasn't here to receive it." "I imagine he does, sir." Bradford nodded slowly. "Get my dress uniform ready and have my driver prepare the staff car, the one with flags. If Nate wants to have this conversation, we're going to do it properly." The drive to Supreme Headquarters took 90 minutes through darkness and rain. Bradford sat in the back of the staff car wearing his full uniform now. The distinctive weapons on his belt, stars gleaming even in the dim light. Every inch the commanding general. But his mind was back at that forward position he had visited that afternoon. The company commander who thought he was talking to a major from Corps headquarters. The honest assessment of ammunition shortages that official reports claimed didn't exist. The tired sergeants who described problems that would never make it into formal channels. Reality. That was what he had been gathering. That was what he had spent the day collecting. Information that would save lives tomorrow, next week, next month. And now Westbrook wanted to talk about operational procedures. Bradford knew what that meant. The staff car pulled up to SHAEF headquarters just before 10. Lights blazed from every window despite the blackout regulations. The war didn't sleep, and neither did the men planning it. An aide met Bradford at the entrance. Young Lieutenant Nervous probably briefed to expect an angry general. Sir General Westbrook is waiting in his private office. He asked that you come immediately. Of course he did, Bradford said. The walk through headquarters felt like walking to a court-martial. Officers in the corridor stopped talking when they saw him pass. They knew. Maybe not the specifics, but they knew that something was happening between the Supreme Commander and the Third Army Commander, and it wasn't going to be pleasant. Westbrook's office was on the second-floor corner, room windows, that in peacetime would have overlooked gardens, but now looked out on sandbagged fortifications and anti-aircraft guns. The aide knocked once opened the door, announced Bradford, and fled. Westbrook sat behind his desk writing something. He didn't look up when Bradford entered, didn't acknowledge his presence, just kept writing with careful, deliberate strokes. It was a power play, a reminder of who held rank in this relationship. Bradford stood at attention anyway. Let Westbrook have his theater. God knew Bradford had enough of his own. Finally, Westbrook set down his pen, looked up. His face was carefully neutral, but Bradford had known this man for 35 years. He could see the anger beneath the professional mask. Close the door, Westbrook said. Bradford closed it. Sit down. Bradford sat. Westbrook stood up and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he had been shouting. Where were you today, Marcus? Forward reconnaissance, Nate, like I told my staff. Forward reconnaissance, Wapwan. Westbrook turned around. That's what you're calling it. That's what it was. Were you alone? I had a driver. Security. Didn't need security. Didn't need... Westbrook's control slipped for just a moment. You're the commanding general of Third Army. You command 300,000 men. You're one of the most valuable intelligence targets in this theater. And you're driving around forward positions alone, wearing God knows what kind of disguise. And you're telling me you didn't need security. Bradford said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make this worse. Westbrook walked back to his desk, sat down, looked at Bradford with an expression that mixed anger and something that might have been concern. Do you have any idea what would happen if you were captured? I wouldn't be captured. You don't know that. Nobody knows that. One German patrol in the wrong place at the wrong time and you're a prisoner. Do you understand what kind of intelligence windfall that would be for them? Not just what you know about Third Army's operations, but everything you know about overall Allied strategy, the invasion plans we've discussed, the operational objectives. I'm careful, Nate. Careful isn't enough. The words came out sharper than Westbrook probably intended. He took a breath, regained control. Your staff doesn't know where you are half the time. If there's an emergency, if something requires your immediate attention, we can't find you. You just disappear for hours, sometimes an entire day. Do you know what that does to the chain of command? Bradford leaned forward. Do you know what it does to the chain of command when an Army commander makes decisions based on incomplete information? Reports aren't incomplete. They're filtered, sanitized. Every level they pass through, they get a little less accurate, a little less honest. By the time information reaches my desk, it's been processed through so many people that it barely resembles what's actually happening. That's how military organizations work, Marcus. That's how command and control functions. You can't be everywhere at once. No, Bradford agreed, but I can be enough places that I understand what's actually happening versus what my reports claim is happening. Westbrook rubbed his temples. How long have you been doing this? Does it matter? Yes, it damn well matters. How long? Bradford considered lying, decided against it. Since Tunisia, since I learned that optimistic reports could get my men killed. 2 years. You've been sneaking around your own army for 2 years, and you didn't think to mention this to anyone. I mentioned it to my chief of staff. And what did he say? He said it was irregular. I told him I didn't care. Westbrook laughed. No humor in it, just exhaustion. Marcus, you can't keep doing this. The risks are too high. The security implications alone. I've saved 500 lives this month, Bradford interrupted. Documented units that were about to launch operations based on faulty intelligence. Supply shortages that would have stopped advances. Equipment failures that would have gotten men killed. I found those problems because I was there, on the ground, seeing what was real, not reading reports. At what cost if you're killed or captured? Then you promote someone else, and the war continues. But those 500 men are still alive because I was willing to take that risk. The silence stretched out between them. Westbrook stared at Bradford. Bradford stared back. This isn't a request, Marcus. This is an order. Stop these solo reconnaissance missions. Stop disappearing without telling your staff where you're going. Stop taking unnecessary risks. Bradford stood up slowly. And if I don't, then I'll relieve you of command and send you home, and we'll see how well Third Army does without you. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Bradford thought about the lieutenant he had talked to that afternoon, the sergeant who had shown him the broken radio equipment, the private who had described going 3 days without hot food because the supply chain had failed and nobody at headquarters knew or cared. He thought about understanding reality, about the difference between what reports said and what was actually happening in his army. He thought about the men who would die if he commanded from a desk based on paperwork instead of reality. I'll be more careful, he said finally. Westbrook's eyes narrowed. That's not what I asked for. It's what you're getting, Nate. I'll coordinate better with my staff. I'll take Pierce with me sometimes. I'll check in more regularly. But I won't stop. I can't stop. Because the alternative is commanding blind, and I won't do that. Marcus, you need me to win this war, Nate. You know it. I know it. Third Army is advancing faster suffering, fewer casualties, and maintaining higher morale than any other force in this theater. And you want to know why? It's because I understand what's actually happening. Not from reports, from walking among my men and seeing what they see. Westbrook was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired. One of these days, your luck is going to run out. Maybe, but not today. God help me, Marcus. I should relieve you right now. But you won't. No, Westbrook admitted. I won't. Because you're right. I need you to win this war. We all do. Bradford moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, Nate, I know you're trying to protect me. I appreciate it, but some things are worth the risk. Westbrook's voice caught. Just try not to get yourself killed. That's all I ask. I'll do my best. Bradford left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Westbrook sat alone in his office, staring at the maps on his wall, all those colored pins representing units and objectives. All those lines showing advances and retreats, all that information flowing up from the field, filtered and processed and sanitized. And somewhere out there, a general in unmarked clothing was learning what all those maps and reports would never show. The mission started 3 days later, just before dawn. Bradford wore his unmarked uniform, standard issue field jacket, no rank insignia, a helmet that could belong to any officer in Third Army. He looked like a major, maybe a lieutenant colonel. Nobody special. Captain Donovan Pierce sat in the driver's seat of the Jeep wearing similar anonymous gear. He had been surprised when Bradford asked him to come along. More surprised when the general explained that he knew Pierce had been watching him for weeks. The scar on my hand, Bradford had said, showing the mark. You're the only one who noticed. That shows observation skills. I can use that. Now they drove through darkness toward a reconnaissance position that official reports said was secure, but that Bradford wanted to see for himself. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, gray dawn bleeding into the darkness, the kind of light that made everything look like it was underwater. Sir, Pierce said quietly, can I ask you something? You can ask, can't promise I'll answer. Why do you do this? Really, not the official reason, the real one. Bradford was silent for a while. When he spoke, his voice had a quality Pierce had never heard before. Introspection, maybe even vulnerability. You know how many men I command, Captain? 300,000, sir, give or take. 300,000. I can't know them all personally, can't shake every hand, learn every name. It's impossible. But I can know enough of them that I understand who they are, what they need, what they're willing to sacrifice. The reports should tell you that. Reports tell me what junior officers think I want to hear, what supply sergeants think won't get them in trouble, what company commanders think makes them look competent. I need more than that. I need to know what a private thinks when he's scared and cold and hasn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. What a sergeant really believes about his equipment. What a lieutenant sees when he looks at his men. Pierce drove in silence, processing this. And the only way to learn that is to talk to them when they don't know you're the general. Exactly. If I show up with my stars and my weapons, they put on a show. Everything gets cleaned up. Problems disappear. I see what they want me to see. But if I show up looking like I'm nobody important, Bradford smiled, then they tell me what's real. They reached the forward position just as full daylight arrived. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance outpost. 6 men watching a sector of the line that German forces had abandoned 3 days ago. Low-risk assignment. Almost boring according to the reports. Bradford and Pierce approached on foot, leaving the jeep hidden in a copse of trees. The position looked normal at first. Sandbags arranged in a defensive semicircle. Equipment covered with camouflage netting. Everything quiet. Too quiet. Bradford's hand went to the pistol under his jacket. Not the chrome ones. A standard issue .45 that didn't announce who he was. Pierce noticed the movement. His own hand drifted toward his weapon. They moved forward carefully. Bradford's instincts, honed by years of combat, were screaming that something was wrong. They found the first soldier in his foxhole. Asleep. Not just dozing, deep sleep. The kind of sleep you fell into when you were exhausted beyond measure. The second soldier was the same. And the third, all 6 men were asleep. Nobody on watch, nobody monitoring the sector they were supposed to be observing. Bradford's jaw tightened. This was a disaster waiting to happen. If German forces were still active in this area, they could walk right through this position without anyone noticing. He kicked the boot of the nearest soldier. Once. Hard. The man jerked awake, reaching for his rifle. Saw Bradford and Pierce standing there in unmarked uniforms. Relaxed slightly. Jesus, Major, you scared the hell out of me. You're supposed to be on watch, Corporal. Why is your entire unit asleep? The corporal rubbed his face. Sir, we've been on this position for 6 days straight. 48-hour rotations, they said. Then they forgot about us. No relief, no resupply. We've been eating K-rations and drinking water from a creek that might have dead Germans in it. Bradford looked at Pierce. Pierce pulled out a notebook and started writing. When's the last time anyone from battalion came to check on you? 3 days ago, sir. Lieutenant came by, looked around for 5 minutes, said everything looked fine. Didn't ask if we needed anything. Didn't mention when we'd be relieved. Bradford woke up the other soldiers. Got the same story from all of them. Abandoned, forgotten, operating on fumes because nobody in the command structure cared enough to verify that they were okay. The worst part was that official reports would show this position as fully manned and operational. Some junior officer had filed paperwork saying everything was fine, and that paperwork had been accepted as truth. This was exactly why Bradford did what he did. He spent 20 minutes talking to the soldiers, learning the details, understanding the failure in the system that had left them here. Then he and Pierce got back in the jeep and drove away. The corporal watched them go, turned to his sergeant. That wasn't a major. No. Did you see how he moved, how he looked at our position? That was someone who's commanded troops, really commanded them, not some staff officer. So who was he? The corporal thought about it, shook his head. Don't know, but I bet we get relieved within 24 hours. He was right. 16 hours later, a fresh unit arrived to take over the position. Hot food came with them, clean water. The abandoned soldiers were rotated back to a rest area. Nobody told them that the major they had talked to was the commanding general of 3rd Army. Nobody had to. They were starting to figure it out on their own. The pattern repeated itself across 3rd Army's operational area. Lieutenant Owen Fitzgerald saw it happen to his platoon. He was at a forward position trying to keep his men's spirits up despite chronic shortages of everything. Ammunition running low, radio batteries dead, no hot food in 4 days despite logistics reports that claimed daily deliveries. An unknown major showed up one afternoon, unmarked uniform, no insignia, asked a lot of questions about supply status. Fitzgerald, thinking he was talking to someone from division staff, answered honestly. Described every shortage, every failure, every problem that official channels seemed to ignore. The major thanked him, left without making any promises. 6 hours later, trucks arrived. Ammunition, radio batteries, hot food, everything Fitzgerald had mentioned. He stood there watching the supplies get unloaded, trying to figure out how division had known. He hadn't filed a formal request, hadn't gone through official channels, had just talked to some random major. His sergeant walked up beside him. That major, the sergeant said quietly. You notice anything strange about him? Like what? Like how he asked questions, real specific, like someone who knows exactly how an army works. And that scar on his hand, I've seen that scar before. Fitzgerald turned to look at his sergeant, where, photograph in stars and stripes, General Bradford shaking hands with some war correspondent. Same scar, same position on the same hand. The words hung in the air between them. You're saying that was General Bradford. I'm saying I don't know who that major was, But our problems got fixed awful fast after he left. The story spread to no one, not officially. Nobody filed reports or sent up the chain of command. But soldiers talked to soldiers. NCOs compared notes. Patterns emerged. Mysterious officers showing up at forward positions, asking detailed questions, then disappearing, followed by the supplies arriving, problems getting fixed, issues being resolved. Always the same pattern, always the same result. And slowly a theory began to form among the men of Third Army. Any unknown officer might be General Bradford in disguise. The effect was immediate and profound. Positions got cleaner, equipment got maintained better. When an unfamiliar officer showed up asking questions, everyone made sure their answers reflected reality because nobody wanted to be caught lying to the general. Bradford had created a kind of psychological omnipresence. He couldn't be everywhere at once, but nobody knew where he would show up next. So they had to assume he might be anywhere. Standards improved across the entire army. Not because of orders or threats or official inspections, because of the belief that the commanding general might be watching at any moment disguised as someone who appeared to be nobody important. Captain Pierce figured it out completely on a rainy afternoon in September. He was in Bradford's quarters delivering some routine paperwork that required the general's signature. Bradford was at his desk writing something in a leather-bound journal that Pierce had never seen before. The general looked up, saw Pierce, and closed the journal quickly. But not quite quickly enough. Pierce had seen what was written on the page. Just a glimpse. But enough. Let Reynolds see me at the checkpoint tomorrow. Build the legend. Bradford noticed Pierce's expression, realized what had happened. For a moment, neither man spoke. You've been documenting it, Pierce said quietly. The disguises, the visits. You've been keeping track of when people see you, when they don't. Bradford set down his pen. How long have you been watching me, Captain? Since August, sir, since I saw you at that machine gun emplacement. The scar on my hand gave me away. Yes, sir, Bradford nodded slowly. And what have you concluded from your observations? Pierce chose his words carefully. That some of your discoveries aren't accidental. You're letting certain people see you, on purpose, to create a mythology. Is that what you think I'm doing? Yes, sir. 80% true invisibility, 20% strategic visibility. Just enough people recognize you to spread the story, to make everyone believe you might be anywhere at any time. Bradford leaned back in his chair, studied Pierce with an expression that might have been respect. How much of it is calculated, sir? Pierce asked. Enough to be effective, not so much that it becomes predictable. Bradford opened the journal again. Come here, Captain. I want to show you something. Pierce approached. Bradford turned the journal so he could read it. Pages of entries, dates, locations, names, detailed observations of what Bradford had seen and heard, but also notes about who might have recognized him, who might have spread the word. The invisibility serves two purposes, Bradford explained. First, it lets me gather unfiltered information, real data from real soldiers. Second, it creates the belief that I might be watching at any moment. That belief makes my men better even when I'm not there. Psychological operation, Pierce said. On our own troops. Psychological motivation. There's a difference. I'm not trying to frighten them. I'm trying to inspire them to maintain standards even when they think nobody's watching. Because they can't be sure nobody is watching. Pierce looked at the journal entries, the careful documentation, the strategic planning behind what appeared to be random wandering. This is brilliant, sir. This is necessary. An army of 300,000 men can't be controlled through traditional command structure alone. There aren't enough hours in the day, but if I can make every officer and every NCO believe that the general might show up at their position tomorrow, dressed as a major or a captain asking questions and observing, Bradford smiled. Then they police themselves. They maintain standards. They tell the truth in their reports because they know I might already know the real situation. Does General Westbrook know about this? Bradford's smile faded. Westbrook knows I visit forward positions in unmarked clothing. He doesn't know about this. He gestured at the journal. The documentation, the calculation, and he doesn't need to know. Sir, I won't. I know you won't, Captain. If you were going to report me, you would have done it weeks ago. The question is, are you willing to help? Pierce felt his pulse quicken. Help how, sir? I need someone at headquarters who can cover for me when I'm gone. Someone who can coordinate my movements without making it obvious. Someone who understands what I'm doing and why. Bradford looked at Pierce directly. I think you're that someone. Sir, if we're discovered, If we're discovered, I'll take full responsibility. You were following orders. Understood. Pierce thought about what he was being asked. To become part of the deception. To actively help the commanding general violate every security protocol in the book. He thought about the soldiers whose supplies had arrived because Bradford had seen their situation. The lives saved because problems were fixed before they became fatal. Understood, sir. I'm in. Bradford extended his hand. Pierce shook it, feeling the scar tissue on the general's left hand. Welcome to the Invisible Army, Captain. Population 2. 300 miles away in his office at SHAEF headquarters, General Nathaniel Westbrook was conducting an experiment. He had decided to try Bradford's method, once, just to see if it worked the way his 3rd Army commander claimed it did. Westbrook wore a colonel's uniform borrowed from his staff. No stars, no name tag, nothing that identified him as the Supreme Allied Commander. He drove himself to a rear area supply depot, walked in like any other senior officer conducting a routine inspection. The difference was immediate and startling. The supply officer didn't snap to attention, didn't call everyone to present arms, just nodded and asked what the colonel needed. Westbrook asked about inventory procedures. The supply officer answered honestly. Described problems with the requisition system, pointed out where bureaucracy was creating delays, admitted that some units were being shorted because their paperwork wasn't filled out correctly. This was information that would never appear in an official report, would never make it to headquarters, was never intended for senior leadership to hear. But Westbrook was hearing it now because the supply officer thought he was talking to just another colonel, someone who might understand the problems but wasn't important enough to punish the messenger. Westbrook spent 2 hours at that depot, learned more about the real state of Allied logistics than he had learned from a month of briefings and reports. He drove back to headquarters in silence, thinking about what Marcus Bradford had been trying to tell him. Reports weren't lies, but they weren't the complete picture either. They were filtered reality, processed and sanitized until they barely resembled what was actually happening. Bradford had figured out how to bypass that filter, how to see reality directly, and it was working. Back in his office, Westbrook sat at his desk and made a decision. He couldn't publicly approve Bradford's methods, couldn't officially sanction a commanding general sneaking around his own army in disguise. The security risks were too high, the protocol violations too severe, but he could stop fighting it, could quietly ensure Bradford had the resources and cover he needed to keep doing what he was doing, could in his own way support the invisible general without ever admitting it. Westbrook picked up the phone, called 3rd Army headquarters. This is General Westbrook. I need to speak with Colonel Ashford. When Ashford came on the line, Westbrook kept his voice neutral, professional. Colonel, regarding General Bradford's fuel allocations for reconnaissance operations. I'm authorizing an increase of 20%. Don't ask him to justify the usage. Just make sure he has what he needs. Ashford was silent for a moment. Sir General Bradford has been conducting extensive reconnaissance. I know what he's been doing, Colonel. Make sure he can continue. Understood? Yes, sir. Understood. Westbrook hung up. He had just given Bradford tacit approval to keep breaking every rule in the book, had provided resources to enable it, had in effect become complicit in the deception. And he knew Bradford would understand what the extra fuel allocation really meant. Permission, protection, partnership. 2 generals who needed each other to win the war. One public, one invisible. One following the rules, one breaking them. Both necessary, both effective. Late September. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Bradford sat in his quarters alone. The distinctive weapons lay on his desk, gleaming even in the dim lamplight. His unmarked field jacket hung on a hook near the door, mud-stained and worn. 2 uniforms, 2 versions of himself, 2 ways of commanding. He was exhausted. Living 2 lives took a toll that he hadn't anticipated. The constant switching between public general and invisible scout. The mental energy required to maintain both personas. The physical strain of driving to forward positions and walking through mud and standing in the rain, talking to soldiers who didn't know they were talking to their commanding general. But when he thought about stopping, he thought about the lieutenant he had talked to yesterday. The one whose ammunition shortage had been fixed within hours of their conversation. The sergeant whose broken radios had been replaced. The private whose unit had been relieved after being forgotten at a forward position. Those men were alive and effective because Bradford had been willing to take the risk, to wear the unmarked uniform, to gather what was real. How could he stop a knock at the door? Pierce entered without waiting for acknowledgement. They had developed that kind of relationship over the past weeks. Sir, we have a problem. Bradford looked up. What kind of problem? Major offensive plan for next week. Intelligence reports say all units are at full readiness. Equipment operational, supply lines established. And you don't believe the reports. Sir, I've been watching how this works. Those reports are exactly the kind of thing you'd want to verify personally. Bradford stood up, walked to the map on his wall, looked at the colored pins representing the units that would participate in the offensive. You're right, he said quietly. I need to see those positions myself. Need to verify that we're actually ready. If we launch this operation and the readiness reports are wrong, a lot of men die, sir. Bradford nodded, looked at his two uniforms, the gleaming sidearms and the unmarked field jacket. We leave at 0600 tomorrow, he said. Wear your plainest gear. This is going to be a long day. Pierce started to leave, then turned back. Sir, you're exhausted. You've been running these missions for days straight. Maybe you should rest. Let someone else. There is no one else, Captain. That's the problem. This is too important to delegate, too important to trust to reports. I need to see it myself. Sir, what happens when your luck runs out, when you push too far? Bradford looked at him. The exhaustion showed in his eyes now, the weight of carrying two identities, of being two generals at once. Then I pushed too far, he said simply. But not today. Tomorrow we're going to verify that offensive is actually ready to launch. And if it's not, we're going to find out before men die. Pierce left. Bradford stood alone looking at his uniforms. The public general inspired. The invisible general understood. Both were necessary. Both were real. Both were him. He picked up the unmarked field jacket, ran his fingers over the mud stains and worn fabric. Tomorrow he would be invisible again. Would gather information that reports wouldn't show. Would verify reality before committing men to battle. It was what he did, what he had to do, even if it killed him someday. Dawn came cold and gray. Bradford and Pierce left headquarters before the first light touched the eastern sky. No fanfare, no escort, just two officers in unmarked uniforms climbing into an unmarked jeep and driving toward the staging areas where Third Army's next major offensive was being prepared. The operation was scheduled to launch in 72 hours, 6 divisions, 40,000 men. The kind of massive coordinated assault that required everything to work perfectly or failed catastrophically. Intelligence reports said everything was ready. Units at full strength, equipment operational, supply lines established. The kind of reports that looked perfect on paper and made generals at headquarters nod with satisfaction. Bradford had learned to distrust perfect reports. They drove through countryside that had been a battlefield 2 weeks ago. Shell craters still marked the fields. Burned-out vehicles rusted beside the road. The smell of death lingered in places where the burial details hadn't finished their work. Pierce drove in silence. He had learned that Bradford used these long drives to think, to prepare himself mentally for what he might find. The general sat in the passenger seat, studying maps, making notes, his face showing the kind of concentration that came before difficult decisions. They reached the first staging area just after 7 in the morning. It should have been a hive of activity. 48 hours before a major offensive unit should be checking equipment, rehearsing assault plans, stockpiling ammunition. Organized chaos, purposeful movement, the unmistakable energy that came when thousands of men prepared for battle. Instead, Bradford saw soldiers sitting around doing nothing. He climbed out of the jeep slowly. Pierce followed. They walked into the staging area wearing unmarked uniforms, looking like field-grade officers from Corps headquarters. Nobody paid them special attention. Bradford approached a group of soldiers cleaning rifles. Morning, where's your company commander? A sergeant looked up. In the command tent, sir. You need something. Just checking on readiness for the operation. When did you receive your ammunition allocation? The sergeant exchanged glances with the other soldiers. We haven't, sir. We were told it's coming tomorrow. Bradford's jaw tightened. And your assault equipment, extra grenades, Bangalore torpedoes, smoke markers? Same answer, sir. Tomorrow. What about rehearsals? Have you walked through the assault plan? The sergeant shook his head. Captain said he'd brief us tomorrow. Tomorrow. Everything was scheduled for tomorrow, which meant that right now, less than 48 hours before launch, this unit wasn't ready. Bradford moved through the staging area asking questions. The picture that emerged made his blood run cold. Ammunition hadn't arrived. Equipment was missing. Soldiers hadn't been briefed on their objectives. Some units didn't even know they were participating in the offensive. And yet the reports flowing up to Army headquarters said everything was on schedule. Pierce appeared at his elbow. Sir, the other staging areas are the same. I talked to 3 different units. None of them are ready. Bradford stood very still. His mind was racing through the implications. If this offensive launched as scheduled with units this unprepared, it would be a massacre. Thousands of men attacking without proper ammunition, without understanding their objectives, without the equipment they needed. The operation would fail. Men would die. For nothing. He could report this up the chain of command, could file an urgent message to headquarters explaining the situation, could work through proper channels to postpone the offensive. But that would take time. Bureaucracy would slow everything down. Some staff officer would want to verify his claims. Questions would be asked about how he had discovered these problems. His methods would come under scrutiny, and in the meantime, the clock would keep ticking toward launch time. Bradford made his decision. He walked to the center of the staging area, to an open space where soldiers from multiple units could see him. Pierce watched him go, suddenly understanding what was about to happen. Bradford reached up and removed his helmet. The stars on his helmet liner caught the morning light, chrome-plated, unmistakable. The nearest soldiers saw first. Their eyes went wide. They nudged their companions, pointed. Within 30 seconds, every man in the staging area was staring. Bradford raised his voice, the command voice, the one that carried across battlefields and parade grounds. I am General Marcus Thaddeus Bradford, Commanding General of 3rd Army, and I am hereby canceling this operation. The words fell into absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 300 soldiers stood frozen, trying to process what they were seeing and hearing. The company commander emerged from the command tent, a captain, young face going pale as he realized what was happening. Sir, I didn't know you were. You didn't know because I didn't tell you, Captain. I came here dressed like this specifically to see what was real. And the reality is that your unit is not ready for combat operations. The captain opened his mouth, closed it. He had no defense. Bradford turned to address the assembled soldiers directly. This staging area was supposed to be ready to launch an assault in 48 hours. Your reports said you were at full readiness. That was a lie. You don't have ammunition. You don't have equipment. You haven't been properly briefed. If I had allowed this operation to proceed as planned, you would have been sent into battle unprepared, and many of you would have died. He let that sink in, watched the understanding spread across their faces. I've been walking among you for months, wearing unmarked uniforms, asking questions, learning what's real instead of what reports claim. Some of you suspected. Some of you had stories about mysterious officers who showed up and then disappeared. Now you know. Those officers were me. A murmur ran through the ranks, soldiers whispering to each other. Recognition dawning, stories being connected. This operation is postponed for 72 hours. You will receive your ammunition today. Your equipment will arrive tonight. Your commanders will brief you properly and rehearse the assault plan. When we launch this offensive, you will be ready, really ready, and you will succeed, because I will not send American soldiers into battle unprepared. Bradford turned to the captain. You're relieved of command. Report to division headquarters for reassignment. The captain's face went white. Sir, I was following the timeline that you were falsifying readiness reports. That ends now. Bradford looked at the lieutenant standing nearby. You're in command until a replacement arrives. Get your men ready, actually ready. Understood. Yes, sir. Bradford put his helmet back on. The stars disappeared under the plane cover, but it didn't matter now. Everyone knew who he was. He walked back to the Jeep. Pierce was already behind the wheel engine running. They drove away in silence. Behind them, the staging area erupted, soldiers talking over each other, officers scrambling to radios. The word spreading like wildfire through 3rd Army. General Bradford had been among them. For months, wearing disguises, learning their truths. The invisible general had revealed himself. The news hit 3rd Army headquarters like a thunderclap. Colonel Ashford received the first radio message within an hour, then another, then 10 more, all saying the same thing. General Bradford had appeared at multiple staging areas, had revealed his identity publicly, had canceled the offensive, had relieved officers on the spot. By noon, the entire army knew. The reaction was complex, not simple approval or disapproval, but a mixture of emotions that reflected the complicated relationship between a commander and his men. Some soldiers were inspired. Their general cared enough to walk among them, to see their reality, to protect them from incompetent leadership. Some were angry. He had been watching them without their knowledge, judging them in secret. Some were embarrassed, remembering conversations with unknown officers, things they had said, complaints they had made, realizing they had been talking to the army commander. But mostly they were stunned. The myth had been proven true. The invisible general was real. Stories emerged from across Third Army, soldiers sharing experiences they hadn't understood at the time. That major who helped me fix my rifle last month, that was Bradford. The colonel who asked about our ammunition situation, that was him. The officer at the field hospital who talked to the wounded, Bradford. Each story confirmed by someone who had noticed something, a scar on a hand, a way of moving, a particular intensity in the questions being asked. The mythology that Bradford had carefully constructed suddenly became concrete, verified, undeniable. He had been everywhere, seeing everything, learning truths that no official report would ever reveal. The summons from General Westbrook came that evening. Not angry this time, just a simple request, please come to SHAEF headquarters at your earliest convenience. Bradford arrived after dark wearing his full uniform now. The distinctive weapons gleamed, the stars caught the light. No point in disguises anymore. Everyone knew. Westbrook's aide led him to the private office. The Supreme Commander stood at the window looking out at the night. Close the door, Marcus. Bradford closed it. Westbrook turned around. His expression was unreadable. You canceled an entire offensive. I postponed it. There's a difference. You relieved multiple officers in the field. They were falsifying readiness reports. You revealed your identity to thousands of soldiers. I had no choice. The alternative was letting the operation proceed and watching men die. Westbrook walked to his desk, sat down, gestured for Bradford to sit. The postponement was the right call, Westbrook said quietly. I've reviewed the situation. You were correct. Those units weren't ready. If the offensive had launched as scheduled, it would have failed. Bradford said nothing, waited. You saved lives, Marcus. Probably hundreds, maybe thousands. That's my job, Nate. Your job is to command Third Army, not to sneak around in disguises gathering intelligence. Bradford leaned forward. And when the intelligence I'm getting is fiction, when the reports say units are ready, but they're not, what then? Westbrook was silent for a long moment. I tried it, he said finally. Your method, wore a colonel's uniform, visited a supply depot without announcing myself, learned more in 2 hours than I learned from a month of reports. Bradford raised his eyebrows. You did? Don't look so surprised. You think I became Supreme Commander by ignoring effective tactics? Westbrook smiled slightly. You were right, Marcus, about needing to see reality instead of reports. You were right and I was wrong to fight you on it. Nate, let me finish. I can't publicly approve your methods. The security risks are real. The protocol violations are severe. But I can stop fighting you, can make sure you have the resources you need, can provide cover when you need it. Bradford understood. The fuel allocations. And other things. Quiet support, never official, never documented, but real. They sat in silence. Two generals who had known each other for 35 years, who had argued and disagreed and challenged each other, who needed each other to win the war. We make a good team, Nate, even when we're driving each other insane. Especially then, Hayes, Westbrook agreed. You push boundaries. I pull you back when you push too far. The tension keeps us both effective. Bradford nodded slowly. I won't be invisible anymore. Everyone knows now. So adapt. Create a new system. That's what you do. Westbrook pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. Poured. The uncertainty will still work. They know you can appear without warning. They just don't know when. They drank in silence. Partners, rivals, friends, both understanding that the invisible general had become visible, but that the principle remained the same. See reality, command from truth. That night, Bradford sat alone in his quarters. The operation was postponed, officers relieved, problems being fixed. But he felt something he hadn't expected. Emptiness. He thought about all the missions he had run, all the soldiers he had talked to while wearing that unmarked uniform, all the truths he had gathered. Had it been worth it, the deception, the risk, the violation of every protocol? He picked up the unmarked field jacket, held it in his hands. How many lives had this uniform saved? How many men were alive because he had been willing to become invisible? He would never know the exact number, could never quantify the value of seeing reality, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would do it again. All of it. Tomorrow. Because the alternative was commanding blind, making decisions based on comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths, and that he could never accept. Bradford hung up the jacket and lay down on his cot. Tomorrow, Westbrook wanted to talk about the future, about how to maintain the principle now that the method was exposed. Tomorrow the war would continue. Tomorrow he would be whatever his army needed him to be, both the general and the soldier, just as he always had been. 3 weeks after the public reveal, the operation launched. This time units were actually ready, ammunition stockpiled, equipment functional, soldiers briefed and rehearsed. The assault succeeded. Objectives taken, casualties minimal. A textbook operation. Bradford watched from a forward observation post, wearing his full uniform now. Stars visible, weapons gleaming, the public general commanding his army. But beside him in the jeep sat an unmarked field jacket, just in case. Because the lesson hadn't changed, only the method had to adapt. Reality mattered more than reports. Truth mattered more than comfortable lies. And a commander who wanted to win had to see what was real, not what paperwork claimed was real. The invisible general might be visible now, but his principle remained eternal. 1 year later, the war in Europe was over. Westbrook and Bradford sat in a borrowed office in defeated Germany, sharing drinks and watching the sun set over a continent that was finally at peace. They had done it. Won the war, brought their armies across an ocean and through the most heavily defended territory on Earth, defeated an enemy that had conquered most of Europe, and survived to tell about it. Can I tell you something, Marcus? Something I've never said out loud. Bradford looked at his old friend. After 35 years, I think you can tell me anything. Westbrook stared into his glass. I was jealous of you. Throughout this whole damn war, I was jealous. Bradford blinked. What? Your decisiveness, your certainty, your connection with the troops. Westbrook's voice was quiet. I spent days making decisions you made in minutes, and your decisions were often just as good as mine, sometimes better. Nate, let me finish. I needed you to win this war, needed your brilliance, your audacity, your ability to see what others missed. But I resented needing you, resented that you made command look effortless when I was struggling with every decision. Bradford was silent, processing this confession from a man who had always seemed utterly confident. I needed you too, Bradford said finally. Someone to give me room to operate, someone to protect me from my own worst impulses, someone to pull me back when I pushed too far. We needed each other, Nate. Neither of us could have done this alone, but Westbrook looked up. You mean that 35 years of friendship, 35 years of driving each other insane, and making each other better in the process? Yes, I mean it. They drank in silence. The disguises, Westbrook said. You knew I knew, didn't you? Bradford smiled. The fuel allocations gave it away. Nobody authorizes extra reconnaissance fuel without asking questions unless they already know what it's being used for. And you knew I was covering for you. Of course, we were both lying to each other. We were both protecting each other, Bradford corrected. You couldn't publicly approve my methods. I couldn't publicly acknowledge your support. So we maintained the fiction. You gave me what I needed. I delivered results. We never discussed it. Westbrook laughed. God, we're a pair. We're partners, Bradford said. Have been for 35 years, even when we were pretending we weren't. The sun touched the horizon. Golden light spilled across the ruined city outside their window. They sat in comfortable silence, two old friends who had fought a war together and survived. What happens now? Westbrook asked. We go home. We become peacetime generals. We write our memoirs and lecture at war colleges and try to explain what we did. Will you tell them about the invisible general? Bradford considered. Some of it, the core truth that leaders need to understand reality, not reports. That seeing with your own eyes beats reading someone else's assessment, but not the calculation. Not the manipulation, just the principle, the lesson without the methodology. Exactly, because the methodology was specific to me, to this war, to this army, but the principle is universal. They finished their drinks as darkness fell. Two generals who had won a war by being exactly what their armies needed, one public, one invisible, both essential, both real, neither complete without the other. 20 years later, Colonel Donovan Pierce stood at a lectern at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Before him sat 200 cadets, the future officers of the American Army. Behind him on a display stand hung two uniforms. One was immaculate, tailored perfectly. Chrome-plated weapons and hand-tooled leather holsters, stars gleaming on the helmet. This was the uniform of General Marcus Thaddeus Bradford, commanding general of 3rd Army, hero of the European campaign. The other was plain, standard-issue field jacket worn and mud-stained, a regulation helmet with no rank markings. This was the uniform Bradford had worn when he walked among his troops, invisible and unknown. Pierce had spent years assembling this lecture, years thinking about what he had witnessed, what he had learned from the invisible general. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you see behind me are two uniforms that belong to the same man. General Marcus Bradford wore both of these during the Second World War, and understanding why he needed both is one of the most important lessons you'll learn at this academy." He walked to the display, touched the distinctive weapons. This uniform inspired soldiers, made them believe they could accomplish the impossible, gave them a symbol to rally around. When men saw General Bradford in this uniform, they stood straighter, fought harder, believed victory was possible. He moved to the unmarked uniform. This uniform revealed truth, allowed General Bradford to see reality instead of reports. Let him talk to soldiers who didn't know they were talking to their commanding general. Gave him understanding that saved countless lives. Pierce turned back to the cadets. "Most of you will spend your careers trying to decide which kind of leader to be, the inspiring symbol or the practical soldier, the visible commander or the invisible observer, and most of you will choose one or the other." He paused, let the words settle. General Bradford chose both, and that choice made him one of the most effective commanders in American military history. A cadet raised his hand. "Sir, isn't that deceptive, wearing disguises to observe your own troops?" "Good question, and it troubled many people at the time." Pierce walked down from the platform. "But consider this, General Bradford didn't use his disguises to catch soldiers making mistakes. He used them to understand reality, to see problems before they became fatal, to verify that orders were actually being carried out. Was that deception? Or was it the only way to pierce through the layers of filtered information that separate commanders from truth? Another hand, sir, can this method be taught, or was it unique to General Bradford?" Pierce smiled. "That's the question General Bradford himself asked, and his answer was interesting. He said the disguise was just a tool. What mattered was the commitment to understanding what was real, to seeing reality instead of accepting reports at face value." He walked back to the display, stood between the two uniforms. "You don't have to wear disguises to be effective leaders, but you do have to find ways to see past the filters, to understand what's really happening in your units, to gather information that reports won't show you." Pierce looked out at the young faces. So much potential, so much to learn. "Here's what I want you to remember. Leadership has many faces. Sometimes your soldiers need inspiration. Sometimes they need someone who understands their reality. The skill isn't choosing which to be. The skill is knowing when to be which." He touched both uniforms. "General Bradford taught me that effective leadership sometimes requires contradictions, that you can be both the symbol and the soldier, both the inspiring general and the understanding friend, both visible and invisible." The lecture hall was silent, every cadet listening. He also taught me something else. The relationships that challenge us most are often the ones that make us best. General Bradford and General Westbrook drove each other insane for 35 years, argued constantly, disagreed on methods, and they needed each other to win the war. He walked back to the lectern. "So here's my final lesson. When you find someone who challenges you, who questions your methods, who makes you defend your decisions, don't push them away. Those are the relationships that will make you better. The tension creates excellence." Pierce looked at the two uniforms one last time. General Bradford died 20 years ago, but his lessons live on. Be whatever your soldiers need. Seek truth over comfortable reports. Value the relationships that challenge you. And remember that leadership isn't about choosing between image and substance. He paused for emphasis. It's about having the wisdom to know when to be which, and the courage to be both. The cadets rose as one, applauding. Pierce stood at the lectern thinking about the invisible general who had taught him everything that mattered about leadership. The lecture ended. The cadets filed out talking among themselves about what they had learned. Pierce stayed behind alone with the two uniforms. He walked to the display, touched the unmarked field jacket, remembered the man who had worn it, who had walked among his soldiers gathering truth, who had been willing to be invisible so his army could see clearly. Bradford's voice echoed in his memory from their last conversation before the general's death. "The lesson isn't about disguises, Captain. It's about commitment. Commitment to understanding reality, to seeing what others miss, to being whatever your people need you to be." Pierce looked at the gleaming weapons, the stars, the symbols of command, then back at the unmarked jacket, the tools of truth. Both necessary, both real, both the same man. He turned off the lights. In the darkness, the two uniforms hung side by side, silent witnesses to a truth that would echo through generations. That leadership requires many faces. That understanding reality matters more than reading reports. That the invisible general and the inspiring symbol can be the same person. That excellence comes from being whatever your people need, and that the courage to be both is what separates good commanders from great ones. Pierce walked to the door, paused, looked back one last time. Two uniforms in the darkness, two identities, one man, one lesson. Be whatever your people need. Have the courage to be both. He closed the door softly. The invisible general had become visible, but his truth remained eternal. Outside the lecture hall, Pierce walked slowly through the evening air. West Point's grounds were quiet at this hour, cadets in their barracks studying or writing letters home. The same rituals that had existed when Bradford and Westbrook had walked these paths 35 years before the war. He found himself at the cemetery, not the main one, but the small plot where Academy legends were buried. Bradford's grave was here marked by a simple stone. No elaborate monument, just his name, rank, and dates. Pierce had visited this grave countless times over the years, but tonight felt different. He knelt down, ran his fingers over the engraved letters. I told them today, sir, he said quietly, told them about the two generals you were, about why it mattered. I think some of them understood. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle played taps. You know what's funny, Pierce continued? Half the officers in the Army now claim they knew what you were doing all along. Say they recognized you during one of your missions. Most of them are lying, of course. But they want to be part of the story. Want to say they were there when the invisible general walked among us. He smiled. You'd probably find that amusing. The mythology keeps growing even 20 years later. Pierce stood up, looked at the stone in the fading light. General Westbrook died last year. I don't know if you knew that wherever you are. Heart attack, quick. He was giving a speech about coalition warfare. Appropriate somehow. He never got to tell you what you meant to him, did he? Not really, not the way he wanted to. The wind picked up. Pierce pulled his jacket tighter. That's the real lesson, isn't it? Not the disguises or the tactics or the command philosophy. It's that we don't tell the people who matter what they mean to us. We think we have time. We always think we have time. He looked up at the darkening sky. I made that mistake too. Never told my wife how much her patience meant during the war years. Never told my sons why I was absent so much chasing a ghost story about an invisible general. And now they're grown and gone, and I can't get those years back. Pierce reached into his pocket, pulled out his old notebook, the one he'd kept during the war. Pages yellowed, now ink fading, but still readable. August 23rd, 1944, he read aloud. Confirmed General Bradford conducts reconnaissance in unmarked uniform. He flipped through the pages. Months of observations, patterns documented, the slow realization that he was witnessing something extraordinary. You changed how I see leadership, sir, how I see truth, how I see the cost of excellence. Pierce closed the notebook. But the most important thing you taught me I didn't understand until right now. He looked at the grave. You taught me that the people who drive us crazy, who challenge us, who make us better, we need to tell them before it's too late. Because Westbrook thought he had time to tell you, and then you were gone. And he spent 20 years carrying that regret. Pierce knelt down again, placed the notebook on the grave. So here's what I'm going to do. Tomorrow, I'm going to call my sons, tell them what I should have told them years ago. I'm going to find the officers who challenged me, who questioned my decisions, who made me defend every choice, and I'm going to thank them. Because that's what you and Westbrook did for each other, even if you never said it out loud. He stood, saluted. Old habits. The cadets will remember the two uniforms. They'll remember the tactics. They'll study your methods and debate whether you were a genius or a maverick. But I'll remember something else. Pierce's voice grew stronger. I'll remember that on December 21st, 1945, you whispered something to Westbrook in that hospital room. Your last words. And he told me later, when he was drunk and grieving, what you said. He looked at the stone. Tell them the truth matters. Tell them to see reality. And tell them to love the people who make them better. Don't wait. Tell them now. The words hung in the evening air. That's the real lesson of the invisible general, Pierce said. Not about disguises or tactics. About relationships, about truth, about not waiting until it's too late. He turned to leave, then stopped. Looked back. I told them today, sir, about leadership, about courage, about being whatever your people need. But tomorrow I'm going to tell them something more important. Pierce smiled. I'm going to tell them about two generals who loved each other like brothers, who drove each other insane, who needed each other to be great, and who waited too long to say it. He walked away into the gathering darkness. Behind him, Bradford's grave stood silent, but the lesson lived on, not just in tactics or methods or military doctrine, but in the simple truth that excellence comes from relationships, that the people who challenge us make us better, and that we must tell them before time runs out. The invisible general had taught his final lesson, not about war, about life. Tell them now before it's too late.